Hey! What's going on? Move your hips more. A passionate scene unfolds in the living room at noon. Strutting my mother on all fours was my husband. Both of them are naked. I felt a powerful shock. Never did I imagine I'd witness such a moment. I feel nauseous. But I can't afford to collapse. I gathered all my strength. I could contact my grandfather immediately. The video call setup is always ready. Without being noticed by the two, who were growling like animals, I pressed the switch. Immediately, my grandfather and relatives appeared on the large screen TV, and my mother and her husband screamed. My name is Heidi, I'm 25 years old. My father, Aaron, made his fortune using the assets gifted to him by my grandfather while he was still alive. He was always cheerful, not just with me but with everyone, a rational person who approached others with calmness. There was only one time when my father lost himself in grief and sadness. It was when my biological mother, Sharon, passed away young from an illness. According to my grandfather, my father's grief was profound, and he seemed like a changed person afterward. At the time of my mother's death, I was only 2 years old. It was before I could remember, and I have virtually no memories of being with her. To me, my mother is the one I have now. My father's second wife, Margaret. When my father said he was going to remarry, my grandfather opposed it. The reason is unclear. Perhaps my grandfather had some suspicions about my new mother. She filled the gaping hole in my father's heart and stopped his flowing tears. I remember my father often saying, "It's good that Margaret came." But honestly, it was hard for me. Because my mother always treated me like a nuisance. She used to click her tongue and glare at me, saying it was difficult to take care of me because I was frail. If I acted even slightly selfish, she would hit me, and she seemed to hate even looking at me. Really annoying. I wish you'd just accidentally fall down the stairs and break your neck. She muttered such frightening things. When it was just her and my father, she acted like a little girl. But with me, she was completely different. In essence, she was only putting on an act in front of my father. I couldn't tell him about it. I was too scared of what my mother might do if I did, so I was paralyzed with fear. It felt unavoidable. It's difficult for any child, let alone someone as meek as me, to accuse their parents. Because of that, I always just took whatever my mother dished out. I treated almost like a slave. Hey! Have you cleaned the living room yet? Get to it, you slacker. Don't call me a slacker. I'll do it right now. What's wrong with calling a slacker a slacker? If you don't like it, then hurry up and move. All my friends' moms are so kind. Why is it different at my house? Even as a child, I wondered about this, but now I understand. My mother probably didn't care about me since she is not my biological mother. One day, the truth about my relationship with my mother came out to my father. Because I told him everything as it was. Mom keeps calling me names like slacker and slowpoke and makes me clean the room all the time. Learning this, my father was furious. "Margaret, come here," he called to my mother. It was the first time I'd seen him angry. My mother was profusely apologetic. She promised she would never be harsh to me again. "Honey, I'm sorry. I'll be kind to Heidi, so please don't be mad." But that promise was just superficial. Afterward, she continued to treat me like a slave or a servant. Her methods became more cunning, just more cautious not to get caught by my father. The way she treated me when we were alone actually became even rougher than before. "Snitching, huh? Do you even understand your place? If you speak ill of me to him again, I won't stop at just hitting you." I was completely bound by fear of my mother. I didn't know what would happen if I defied her. It was better to just keep quiet and obey than to suffer the pain. I became more introverted, started staying in more, and began skipping school frequently. The only place I went to regularly was my grandfather's house. That's because my father would take me there. My kind grandfather was also an experienced businessman like my father. They would always talk about things I didn't understand. If something ever happened at home, I would always plan to escape to my grandfather's house. I often thought about that. My father passed away when I was in middle school. It was a car accident. It was too devastating. Because of that, I barely remember anything around the time of my father's funeral. After my father passed away, my mother's behavior completely changed. She would hurl insults at me boldly and without restraint at any time. "Can't you understand when I tell you to hurry up and make dinner? You slacker. Stop it. Please don't yell. I'll make dinner now. It's your fault for being a slacker. You're really useless." I was utterly her servant. Day after day, she exploited me relentlessly. I think she was frustrated at that time. Because contrary to her intentions, most of my father's estate was placed under my grandfather's management. Perhaps my father knew about the issues between my mother and me. In case something happened to him, he must have discussed what to do with his assets with my grandfather in advance. At a family gathering, my grandfather spoke to my mother and me. "Heidi, when you're grown up, I'll return your share according to the will." "Dad, what about my share?" "There's nothing specific in the will about your share, Margaret. You can manage with the assets you have, right? Then there should be no problem." "Oh, yes. That makes sense." After we returned home, my mother was furious. "Why don't I have any share?" she raged. She vented her resentment towards my grandfather and took her anger out on me. "You haven't been snitching to that old man, have you?" "No, I haven't. I don't know anything." "That damn old man, just you watch. When he distributes it, I'll make sure all the property in this house becomes mine. Stupid old fool. It's only a matter of time." My mother was like a demon. She was completely driven by greed. She came to this house for the money. I came to understand that, without anyone needing to tell me. Eventually, as an adult, I was to receive a large inheritance according to the will. But if I held on to that large sum, my mother might forcefully take it from me. After thinking it over, I connected to my grandfather's house via video call from our home. "I'm not ready to use this money yet, and I'm scared to keep it. Can you hold on to it for now, Grandpa? I'll come get it when I need it. Is that so?" "All right. Heidi, you're a smart girl. I'll do as you say." My mother was watching this video call too. I don't think the small click of her tongue I heard wasn't my imagination. She was surely planning to somehow take the inheritance if I had accepted it outright. I breathed a sigh of relief. Despite being at home, I felt uneasy. I had normal desires for marriage like anyone else. But maybe my reserved nature was to blame. Regrettably, even after turning 20, I hadn't had a single romantic prospect. While I was sighing about it, surprisingly, my mother made an unexpected suggestion. "Should I introduce you to a handsome guy? He's almost too good for you." But what does this guy do?" "Is he a friend of yours?" "A friend's son." "What does he do again?" I forgot. The man my mother brought was Thomas. He was 26 years old. Just as my mother said, he was quite handsome. He was also polite and interesting to talk to, and he seemed to like me. With little experience in romance, I quickly became infatuated with Thomas. And within about half a year, we got married. The ceremony was modest, as Thomas wished. I couldn't believe I was getting married. I was so happy I cried. However, as soon as we got married, Thomas's attitude changed drastically. His language became rough, and he acted arrogantly and even started smoking. He started going to casinos, slots, and racetracks, and he was debauched on a daily basis. It seemed he had been restraining himself all this time until we got married. I felt betrayed. "Why?" "Hey, Thomas, please stop smoking. It's going to make our house smell. If it stinks, then you clean it up. Don't nag your husband. Then could you at least quit gambling? It's like throwing money down the drain. Don't lecture me on something you've never done. You have to buy lottery tickets to win? It's the same thing. This man is just like my mother. I felt that instinctively. He showed his true colors as soon as he achieved his goal of marrying me. His aim was probably the same as my mother's. The property left by my father. Afterward, I was treated like a maid by my mother and husband, used from morning till night. Something was off about my mother and husband's relationship. I started to feel this about 6 months after getting married. They were overly affectionate, and sometimes they would go out together. Though we were married, my relationship with my husband was in name only. I no longer loved him after he revealed his greedy nature. So honestly, I didn't care much, and it was still incredibly disgusting. They clung to each other like lovers. My mother and husband, with an age difference of about 20 years. It was mostly my mother who was smitten, grinning at him. His not-so-reluctant demeanor was unbearably unpleasant to me. My mother claimed to be a beautiful witch, and indeed, she didn't look like someone in her 40s. But of course, she couldn't compare to us in our 20s. There's only so much you can hide. One day, I felt so sickened that I couldn't stand it anymore, and I confronted them. Can you please not be all over each other here? It's disgusting. What's so disgusting about it? Heidi, you've been rather cheeky lately. My bad, I'll hold back. But it's hard when Margaret won't let go. It's because Thomas is so handsome, isn't it? Really, sweetie? My mother and husband playfully clinging to each other. It's unbearable to watch. The atmosphere between them was unmistakably that of lovers. I was always curious where the two of them went when they went out together. I don't regret hiring a detective agency to look into it. I learned a lot about my mother and husband, and I was able to figure out what I should do next. However, the emotional damage was significant. Reading the investigation report completely knocked me down. I felt so unwell that I had to retreat to my room and rest for a while. Finding certain documents in my husband's room the day before also contributed to my mental unrest. That day was the 3rd anniversary of my paternal aunt's death. Relatives were gathering at my grandfather's house. But there was no way I could go in such a condition. I contacted my grandfather and asked to be excused. The investigation report revealed only shocking truths. There were many hard-to-accept facts. What should I do now? How should I confront them and fight back? While pondering these thoughts, I had fallen asleep. I was awakened by a noise about an hour later. From the living room, I could hear fierce voices like growling beasts. It seemed my mother had returned with my husband. It was not a fight. This was it. Hey! What's going on? Move your hips more. A passionate scene unfolded in the living room during the day. Straddling my mother on all fours was my husband. Both of them were naked. I felt a powerful sense of dizziness. Never did I imagine I'd witness such a moment. They probably thought I was at the memorial service at my grandfather's house. What a horrifying sight. Though technically in-laws, they were parent and child. I felt nauseous, but I couldn't afford to collapse. I mustered all my strength. I secretly called my grandfather to set up as usual. The video call setup was ready to go, as always. Unaware and still growling like animals were my mother and husband. Without them noticing, I gently pressed the switch. Immediately afterward, my grandfather and relatives appeared on the large screen TV. My mother's screams echoed in the living room. The shock was evident on the faces of my grandfather and relatives too. No wonder. My grandfather was supposed to be on a video call with me. He certainly wasn't expecting to see his naked daughter-in-law and son-in-law appear. I felt terribly sorry for exposing them to such a distressing scene. What's this? What's going on here? What are you two doing? It's not what it looks like. Please believe me. I don't understand. Both of you, just put your clothes on now. What the heck is this? Why is this happening all of a sudden? My mother, still naked, fled behind the sofa. Our eyes met as I stood there. Her expression quickly turned to one of anger. But I wasn't planning to just stand there and take it anymore. I grabbed clothes that had been discarded nearby and threw them at my mother. "Why don't you go to the other room and put these on? You look disgraceful. Thomas, you too. Heidi. How dare you embarrass me like this? You think you're gonna get away with this? That's my line. First of all, shouldn't you be embarrassed by what you're doing? Sleeping with your mother-in-law, of all things. How could you even do such a thing? Shut up. Just be quiet." My husband quickly grabbed clothes and disappeared into the next room. My mother also sneaked away, and the living room suddenly went quiet. My grandfather and the relatives were still in shock. I apologized to everyone via the screen. "I'm sorry for suddenly showing you such a disgraceful scene. Heidi, tell us. Have those two always been involved like this?" "Grandpa, I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner." "Yes, it's true. They've always been overly affectionate at home, too. They've never been this blatant about it, though." "Really? What in the world?" My mother and husband had indulged in such acts, likely because they mistakenly thought I had gone out to the memorial service. When I mentioned this, my grandfather let out a huge sigh. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his expression troubled. "Anyway, I'm coming over right now. Heidi, I'm worried about you." "Yes, please. As soon as you can. Also, I'll send the data from the report I had the detective agency prepare. Grandpa, please take a look at it when you can." "A detective agency? Heidi, you had to do all this on your own? I'm sorry I didn't notice sooner." "I'll be there immediately, just wait for me." "Thank you, Grandpa." I ended the video call. The die was cast. There was no turning back now. When I turned around, my mother and husband were standing at the entrance to the living room. Both of them were glaring at me with fierce looks. I glared back just as intensely. I was no longer the compliant child I once was. I have to fight for my life on my own terms. I'm determined to fight thoroughly and exclude these two from my life. That was my strong resolve. My mother walked towards me aggressively. I kept the same distance from her. "I don't like violence. Is that okay?" I asked, and she stopped. "Okay? What do you mean? Do you have something you want to say?" "I know everything now. About you and Thomas." I got curious, so I had everything checked out thoroughly using a detective agency. "Didn't you notice until now? You investigated? Sneaking around investigating your own mother, what a strange thing to do. Are you crazy? Doing whatever you want. It seems like you were doing a lot of things that shouldn't be found out, weren't you?" I too was shocked to learn the truth. So much so that it made me physically ill and I had to lie down. At the same time, I was incredibly angry. It's fair to say that anger made up the bulk of my feelings. Tell the truth. "Mom, Thomas, you're both part of a fraud group, aren't you?" "Huh? What are you talking about? Have you been watching too many dramas or something? Don't play dumb. I told you I've done my research. Would I say this without proof?" When I glared, my mother clammed up with a serious face. From the beginning, my mother only approached my father, who had lost his first wife, my biological mother, for his money. Perhaps my father had some understanding of my mother's true intentions. Perhaps my father understood my mother's true intentions to some extent and still chose to be with her. Let me guess, you planned to take all the money from me too, right? You wanted to take over all of Dad's inheritance. But then you couldn't because of his weird will. That's right. Because of that strange will, the inheritance came under old man's management. You, having come of age and inherited it, got scared of handling all that money and let old man manage it. Don't call Grandpa an old man. Quiet. It's none of your business how I refer to him. My mother spat on the floor. It seems my decision to rely on my grandfather was correct. If the money had been under my control, who knows what would have become of it. It would have been ripped off by my mother and husband long ago and spent. In fact, the cash in the accounts, the securities, and other assets, excluding real estate, had already been tampered with. The numerous antiques and collectibles that my father had amassed as a hobby. My father's collection room was now completely empty. My mother and husband had sold everything off through online auctions. My father's belongings had been completely scattered. I glared at my mother and asked, "What did you use the money from selling Dad's collection for?" "Why should I have to tell you that?" "They were spent on gambling. We circulated the money." "Antiques, no one in this house knew its value anyway. It was more beneficial to sell them, right?" "That's just selfish. You just wanted money to play around with, didn't you?" When I glared, my husband shrugged with a mocking expression. He was mocking me. He thought I couldn't do anything. I decided first to separate my mother and husband. As I said before, I've already found out that you two are part of a fraud group. The investigator was even shocked. They suggested reporting you. Report? Did you report us? Not yet. Thomas, it seems like your father is also part of the fraud group. Mom introduced you to me as the son of an acquaintance. Your father is an acquaintance because he's part of the same fraud group, right? How much have you looked into? Do you have undeniable evidence? What do you know about my dad? Hey, tell me. Thomas, my mother shouted. She didn't want him to say too much. Compared to my mother, Thomas was still easier to handle. I deliberately maintained a strong demeanor. It was 2 against 1, and I was at a disadvantage. Still, I needed to appear as if I was in a position of advantage. Otherwise, they might seize any moment of weakness to overpower me. What? You want to protect your dad? Then answer my questions. Depending on your answers, I might only report Mom to the police and let you and your dad off the hook. Thomas. Don't be fooled. Heidi is planning to go to the police in the end anyway. Plus, if one of us gets caught, the rest will follow. Thomas, what will you do? Do you trust me? Look, I never wanted to sleep with this old lady. Unexpected words burst out. My mother was shocked. Thomas's face looked like he was about to cry. He stepped back from my mother, pointing at her and yelling. It's true. To me, she's just an old lady. But she's a friend of my dad's, respected among our group, and too intimidating to cross. So, I just... What are you saying? Thomas, you told me you liked me. What the heck? You forced me to say it. Under duress. I've hated this all along. An old woman's flirting makes me sick. Thomas, I will never forgive you. I'll have the guys beat you up. Guys likely referred to members of the fraud group. I had successfully induced infighting. Still, I felt awful. These two were just too vile. They lived in a reality far removed from any common decency. Heidi, I'm with you. Let's kick this old woman out together. That's kind of you. And while we're at it, could you tell me in your own words? You and my mom have been part of the fraud group all along, right? You came here just for the money? That's right. The initial plan was to exploit the vulnerability of your dad after he lost his first wife. Margaret played it well. Hey. Thomas, stop. Don't blabber unnecessary things. But by then, my mother could no longer stop my husband from talking. He spilled everything about how they were major players in a large fraud group, how the parents were high-ranking members. A part of the money made from selling my father's collection had been paid as tribute to their organization. Thomas voluntarily continued to disclose various other things before I even asked. And we even had a plan to eliminate you, Heidi. What? Eliminate me? Yeah, it's a common method in our group. Make it look like an accident. Can't you see I'm telling you to stop? She's trying to make me spill everything. You're probably recording this, aren't you? Huh? It was out. Yes, I had been recording secretly. My smartphone was on, with the voice recorder app active. Considering the quiet in the living room, I was confident the recording would be clear. My mother glared at me. But I was past the point of backing down or apologizing. I was ready to resist with all my might, and if attacked, I was sure to fight back. I wasn't about to lose. And through this conversation, it became all too clear. My mother is a handful, but I feel like I can manage Thomas. I decided to further unsettle Thomas with my next move. Thomas, I need to apologize to you for something. What? What is it? I went into your room without permission and read the documents you had filed there. What? Seriously? What did you do that for? That's why I always told you to lock your room. You idiot. Don't you have any sense of crisis? That's the problem with young people these days. The documents in Thomas's room were related to fraud. They detailed the fraud schemes and methods that the group had successfully executed. It was highly organized and systematic. Reading it made me feel sick. Con artists like them have no conscience. It's despicable to deceive people for profit. They took advantage of my father's sorrow and my naivety to try to take over our house from the inside. There's one more thing I absolutely can't forgive. In fact, the anger about that matter is what's been driving me lately. About my father? How he died. What? My father. It was a car accident. That was your doing, wasn't it? Just like Thomas had mentioned earlier. Making it look like an accident is a common tactic for them. In fact, it was clearly written in the documents in Thomas's room. The death of my father was part of their group's plan. My mother suddenly started laughing. It was a disgusting, infuriating laugh to hear. Yes. Our group did it. But what can you do about it now? It's already been dealt with as an accident. That's despicable. Shame on you. Say whatever you like. Now, shall we ask you to be quiet? You're the one who should be quiet, Margaret. My mother's eyes widened. Standing at the entrance to the living room was my grandfather. He had driven here as fast as he could. His timing couldn't have been better. Grandfather looked furious. He must have heard our conversation, which would explain why. It's clear now. Because of what you did, my son lost his life. No, I mean, I didn't directly do anything myself. It's the same thing. Don't move, Thomas. Yes, sir. Thomas trembled under my grandfather's stern command. Just as he tried to escape, it was as if he had been struck by lightning. Seeing the truth about his son's death, my grandfather's face turned red with anger. Grandfather is well-built and vigorous, showing no signs of aging. He would definitely overpower Thomas. It was questionable whether my mother and Thomas together could take him on. Now, we clearly had the upper hand. To my frightened mother and Thomas, my grandfather shouted like a demon. Sit down. Both of you. I'm calling the police right now. And don't even think about escaping. Even if you try, I'll make sure you get caught. No! Please, not the police! What, you have something to hide? If you've done nothing wrong, then act like it. Are you admitting to being fraudsters right here? I'm truly sorry. Please, just don't call the police. I'll do anything, Grandpa. Finally, my mother knelt on the floor. She clasped her hands together, looking like she was about to cry as she begged my grandfather. My mother, known for her fierce temper and high pride, was admitting defeat. It was a declaration of her defeat. It seemed she had realized she couldn't win against grandfather and me. My mother repeatedly expressed her remorse, begging not to call the police, promising to sell out information. I'll tell you the names of the leaders of the group. I'll tell you all their hideouts. I'll give you every detail about their methods, who they're targeting next, everything. Just. So, you want us to let you go? Don't be ridiculous. You think you can bargain? You're a century too early for that. But, Thomas, what are you doing? You apologize too. I'm truly sorry. I won't upset Heidi anymore. I won't commit any more fraud. Please forgive us. Mother and Thomas both rubbed their foreheads on the floor. I saw no value in their prostration. Grandfather seemed to feel the same. With narrowed eyes, he glared at them, barked to keep their mouths shut. You and all your accomplices, I'll make sure you all end up in prison. Think of all the people who have suffered because of you. Don't think you can save yourselves. Cries echoed in the living room during the day. Those were the cries of my mother and Thomas. How pathetic. It marked the end of the long-standing dominion my mother and Thomas had over this house. That day, Grandfather made Thomas sign the divorce papers, setting me free. I also cut ties with my mother, finally gaining my freedom for the first time. Later, my former mother and former husband were arrested and charged. The statutory penalty for fraud is up to 10 years in prison. A conviction would definitely result in a prison sentence. If it became clear that they had deliberately taken my father's life, my former mother's sentence would surely be even heavier. Personally, I wish they would stay in prison for life. That's honestly how I felt. When the sentence was confirmed, both my former mother and former husband cried bitterly. It was the retribution for the pain they caused. I want them to fully pay for their crimes. My former mother and former husband were definitely members of a fraud group. It seems there are many across the nation who have suffered at the hands of their group. The evidence I provided to the police made their activities clear. The documents were full of detailed accounts of the frauds and their malicious methods. These led to the eventual crackdown on the entire group, which was quite surprising. All I wanted was to avenge my father's death, but I unexpectedly contributed to eradicating the fraud group. If this helps reduce the number of people suffering from fraud, then I find it truly gratifying. While my former mother and former husband were incarcerated, I met a trustworthy man. It was my grandfather who introduced him. He is a young salesperson working for the company my grandfather, a businessman, runs. He is capable, cheerful, promising for the future, and also handsome, a wonderful person indeed. Due to my former mother, a fraudster, I had constantly endured unpleasant experiences. But from now on, things will be different. I am determined to pursue my own happiness and live every day with a smile. I told my Father in heaven and my real mother to watch over me in peace.